Michael Harrison, a successful black lawyer, faces a deeply biased legal system as he defends a case exposing corporate discrimination. Throughout the trial, the judge and defense attorney dismiss critical evidence, blatantly undermining his efforts. Despite his status, Michael is subjected to microaggressions and subtle racism, with the courtroom treating him as inferior and disregarding his expertise. As the trial progresses, Michael realizes the system is rigged against him and others like him, prompting him to take a stand, an act of defiance against an unjust, corrupt establishment that favors the powerful and silences the marginalized. Michael Harrison was a man of quiet power, the kind of power that wasn't flaunted but quietly exuded from his presence, even when he wore nothing more than a well-tailored navy suit and a pair of brown leather shoes that had seen better days. His wealth, his success, his influence, none of it was visible in the way he moved through the world. There were no flashy watches, no expensive cars parked out front, no name-dropping at dinner parties. For all his accomplishments, Michael preferred the understated elegance of simplicity. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of crisp fall day where the sun breaks through the clouds and leaves dance along the sidewalks, hinting at the change of seasons. Michael was on his lunch break, seated in a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of Chicago's South Loop. The smell of fresh brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air as he sipped on a cup of black coffee, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of the mug. The cafe was the kind of place where people didn't look twice, where the noise of the city outside was muffled, and the only chatter inside came from regulars exchanging pleasantries. It wasn't the kind of spot that attracted attention, and Michael liked it that way. His usual table by the window was the perfect place to sit, observe, and unwind for a few minutes, away from the high-stakes world of corporate law. Outside, the busy streets were lined with towering glass buildings reflecting the late afternoon sun. But inside, the cafe was a world unto itself, warm, simple, and ordinary. Michael didn't mind being ordinary. In fact, he preferred it. He wasn't one for flash or attention. His mind was always working, but he kept it to himself. To the outside world, Michael Harrison was just another black man who had made it to the top. Just another successful lawyer in a city full of them. No one noticed him as he sat there, quietly observing life moving around him, blending in with the rest of the world. Yet Michael's reality was a world of contradictions. As a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago, he wielded more power than most could ever imagine. His reputation was well established, sharp, effective, and unrelenting in the courtroom. His colleagues knew him as a man who could argue any case with precision, who could break down complex legal jargon with ease. But outside the office, away from the boardrooms and the legal battles, he was a man who preferred to keep a low profile, avoiding the spotlight whenever he could. He took another sip of his coffee and watched the people pass by. A young couple laughed as they walked past the window, their hands intertwined. A woman in a crisp white jacket and black heels hurried down the street, her face lit by the glow of a phone screen. The rhythm of the city was a comforting hum, and Michael often found solace in it. The world outside was chaotic and fast-paced, but here, in this small cafe, he could find a sense of calm, if only for a few moments. The bell above the door jingled as a man walked in, the warm afternoon light streaming behind him. Michael didn't notice him at first, but the man's voice cut through the air when he approached the counter. "I'll take a latte, and make it quick, please." The barista, a young woman with short blonde hair and a slightly impatient expression, nodded and began to prepare his order. Michael didn't pay much attention to him at first, but the man's voice had an edge to it, like he was used to giving orders and expecting them to be followed without question. His shoes clicked sharply on the floor as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, and Michael couldn't help but notice how out of place the man seemed in this modest cafe. His suit was sleek, designer, cut perfectly, but just a little too loud for this setting. He seemed almost uncomfortable, as though he didn't belong in a place like this. Michael glanced at him once, then looked away, returning his attention to his coffee. He wasn't interested in making conversation or taking notice of the people around him. But then, the man caught his eye. Michael's sharp gaze met his for a brief moment. There was something about the man's expression that made Michael pause. It wasn't the usual indifference or fleeting curiosity that most people displayed when their eyes met his. No, this was different. The man's gaze was filled with a certain kind of judgment, like he had already assessed Michael in the time it took him to walk from the door to the counter. It wasn't hostile, but it was dismissive, as if he didn't believe someone like Michael belonged here, in a place like this. Michael didn't flinch. He had gotten used to the stares, the quiet moments when people tried to place him in a box that they thought he should fit into. But there was something about this man's gaze that lingered. Michael set his coffee down, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded away. He felt his pulse quicken, but he remained still, his eyes steady on the man who had clearly made an assumption about him. The man took his coffee, muttered a quick thanks, and turned to leave. But not before giving Michael one last look. This time, Michael held his gaze longer. The man's eyes flickered with a slight flicker of unease, like he realized he might have misjudged something. He quickly averted his gaze and walked out the door, but the interaction had left its mark on Michael. For a moment, he sat still, taking in the weight of the moment. It was a small thing, an insignificant glance from someone he'd never see again. But for Michael, it was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter how many accolades, awards, and victories he had amassed, there would always be people who saw him as something less. In a world where his skin color would always stand out, the expectations placed on him were never just about his achievements. There was always an unspoken expectation that he had to prove himself every single time. But Michael didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His success spoke for itself. It was just a reality he had learned to live with, a reality that sometimes made his accomplishments feel a little less satisfying than they should have been. There was always the constant reminder of the world's deep-seated prejudices, whether it was in a corporate boardroom or a humble cafe. But instead of letting those moments weigh him down, Michael had learned to turn them into fuel, a reminder of why he had worked so hard to get where he was. He had learned to rise above them, to do what he did best without asking for validation or approval. As Michael stood up and paid for his coffee, he felt a sense of clarity settle in. He had a meeting to attend later. Something urgent, a case that could push his firm to the next level. But this moment, this brief encounter in the cafe, had reminded him of something important, that no matter how successful he became, the challenges he faced, both systemic and personal, would never fully go away. But that wasn't something to be afraid of, it was something to use. The world's expectations didn't define him, his actions did. He walked out of the cafe and into the cool afternoon air. The city was bustling around him, people moving from one place to another, each in their own world. But Michael had learned to walk through it all with a sense of calm, a quiet confidence that no one could take away from him. He wasn't a billionaire tech mogul or a famous judge. He was just Michael Harrison, a man who had earned his place and had no intention of letting anyone take it from him. The light glinted off the glass skyscrapers above him, and for a brief moment, Michael wondered just how much the world truly saw of him. But that wasn't the question that mattered. The question that mattered was how much he saw the world, and how he could change it. He smiled to himself and continued on, the city alive with possibility in every direction. As Michael Harrison walked down the street, the cool breeze against his skin seemed to remind him that life, despite its complications, continued on. He passed the glass-lined buildings and the people who walked through them as though they belonged to a world that was entirely separate from his. He had worked hard to get where he was, but even now, there were moments when he felt like an outsider in the world of success. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back from his thoughts. He pulled it out, noting the name on the screen. Adam Caldwell, his associate, and someone he trusted deeply. "Hey, Michael," Adam's voice came through the phone, laced with tension. "We've got a situation down at the courthouse. I need you to get over here." Michael's steps faltered. He knew Adam well enough to understand that when his associate said situation, it wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was serious. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. He slid his phone back into his pocket and made his way toward the courthouse, a familiar landmark in downtown Chicago that had seen many of his hard-earned victories. But today, it felt like a reminder of the challenges that never seemed to stop coming. As he approached the courthouse, Michael could feel the air growing heavier, the weight of the system pressing in on him. He had been inside these walls countless times, fighting cases, negotiating deals, and advocating for justice. But the building wasn't just a place of law, it was a reminder of the biases that ran deep within the system, a reminder that for all his accolades, Michael was still a black man, in a world that often saw him as less than. He pushed open the doors and entered the lobby, taking in the familiar buzz of activity. Court officers walked briskly, and attorneys in sharp suits gathered in clusters, their voices a low hum. But as Michael made his way past the security desk, the officer behind the counter gave him a brief glance, a quick look that seemed to linger just a little longer than necessary. Michael felt a shift in the air. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The subtle, underlying discomfort that came from someone judging him not by who he was, but by what they assumed about him. "Can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, his voice cool, almost dismissive. Michael nodded, keeping his composure. "I'm here to meet with Adam Caldwell. I'm Michael Harrison." The officer's eyes flickered over him, lingering on Michael's dark skin and modest attire. His gaze seemed to linger for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Michael recognized the look. It was the same look he had received countless times before, a look that asked if he truly belonged in this space, if he was truly someone of significance. "Right, Mr. Harrison," the officer said, his tone tightening. "I'll need to check your ID." Michael's gaze stayed steady as he reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his driver's license. The officer took it, glancing down at it, before looking back up at Michael, his face unreadable. It wasn't the usual protocol, but Michael didn't say anything. He knew what was happening here. It was subtle, but it was there. The officer wasn't sure if someone like Michael, someone who didn't fit the expected mold, could possibly have the credentials to be inside the courthouse. After what felt like an eternity, the officer handed back the ID. "All right, you're clear. You can go ahead," he said, his voice almost begrudging as he motioned toward the elevator. Michael took the ID with a calm nod, walking past the officer and making his way to the elevators. He could feel the officer's eyes still on his back as he disappeared into the crowd. The frustration inside him stirred, but he kept it in check. He had learned long ago that there was little point in fighting battles with people who would never see him for who he truly was. Instead, he channeled that frustration into something more productive. When Michael reached the courtroom floor, he was met by Adam, who was standing near the entrance, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. Adam was younger, eager, and as sharp as they came. Michael had brought him into the firm a few years ago, and he had proven to be a valuable asset. But today, Adam seemed rattled. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his voice low but commanding. "We've got a mess," Adam said, his eyes flicking nervously toward the courtroom doors. "It's the Thompson case, the judge. We've run into a bit of a problem." Michael's brow furrowed. The Thompson case had been one of their most high-profile civil suits in recent months. A tech company had been accused of discriminating against its black employees, and the evidence was strong. It was a case Michael had personally championed, seeing it as an opportunity to address broader issues of systemic racism in the workplace. But now, something felt off. "We're up against Judge Thomas," Adam continued. "And well, there's been some talk that he's not exactly impartial. The courtroom's been pretty tense." Michael's gut twisted. Judge Thomas was a seasoned member of the judiciary, known for his conservative leanings, but Michael had always assumed he could keep his emotions in check. This didn't sound like just a minor issue, it sounded like something much deeper. Without saying a word, Michael walked toward the courtroom doors, his mind already working, calculating his next move. Inside, the room was filled with the usual players: attorneys, the jury, and of course, Judge Thomas himself, sitting high behind the bench, his eyes already scanning the room with an air of detachment. "Mr. Harrison, I see you've decided to join us," Judge Thomas said, his voice gruff. He didn't even look up from his papers as Michael stepped forward. Michael's hand clenched briefly, but he kept his voice calm. "Your Honor, I'm here to represent the plaintiff in the Thompson case. I understand we're ready to proceed?" Judge Thomas's gaze flicked toward him, and Michael caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The judge's subtle shift in demeanor wasn't lost on Michael. "Indeed," Judge Thomas said, his tone colder than before. "I would appreciate it if we could keep the interruptions to a minimum. This is a court of law, after all." Michael resisted the urge to challenge him outright. He had learned long ago that in these situations, it wasn't about winning the immediate battle. It was about surviving long enough to win the war. The proceedings began, and Michael quickly realized that this was no ordinary courtroom session. The judge's questions were pointed, dismissive. He seemed uninterested in the facts, and more focused on making the defense look good, letting them get away with questioning the credibility of the black employees involved. It was a subtle form of bias, but it was clear to Michael that the judge was working with an agenda. As the hearing dragged on, Michael's frustration grew. The defense lawyer's tactics were predictably underhanded, but it was the judge's blatant disregard for the law that gnawed at him. Every time Michael presented a piece of evidence, Judge Thomas dismissed it with an offhand comment or a sarcastic remark. The tension in the room began to rise, and Michael could feel his pulse quicken as his own sense of justice flared within him. He kept his composure, but deep inside, the anger built every inch of this case. The systemic failures, the blatant racism, was an assault on the very principles he had worked so hard to uphold. His mind was racing, calculating the steps he needed to take to challenge this injustice. But the more he tried to navigate the proceedings, the more he realized just how much of a battle this was going to be. He knew it wasn't just about winning the case, it was about something far more personal, a fight for recognition, for dignity, for the right to be seen as equal in a system that never truly had been. And in that moment, Michael knew that this case would change everything. But first, he had to survive it. The courtroom had grown unbearably tense, the air thick with the unspoken weight of the biases hanging over every moment. Michael Harrison stood at the center, trying to hold on to the last remnants of professionalism. But it was becoming harder to breathe, let alone think clearly. Judge Thomas had once again dismissed an important piece of evidence with a wave of his hand, and the defense lawyer had seized the moment, making another inflammatory argument against the credibility of the plaintiff. It was as if they were all playing some game, one where Michael's side wasn't allowed to win, no matter how strong the evidence was. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood echoed in the silence of the room. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his stern eyes boring into Michael. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've warned you about wasting this court's time with irrelevant arguments. If you continue with these unnecessary tactics, I'll have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Michael's jaw clenched. He had already been holding back the anger that boiled inside him for the past hour. This wasn't just about legal tactics anymore. It was about principle. The judge, the system. They were all stacking the odds against him, against the truth. Every word, every look from the judge made it clear that this wasn't a fair fight, and yet, Michael had to hold it together. He couldn't let his anger show. Not now, not when so much was at stake. The jury, too, was being subtly swayed. Michael could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided looking directly at him or his team. They'd already been influenced by the subtle biases the judge had allowed to infect the room Michael had been through, enough cases to know when the fight was rigged, and this one had all the markings of a losing battle. But he wouldn't back down. He couldn't. "You'll have your evidence, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice tight but steady. "I'll reserve my argument for closing statements." Judge Thomas didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, a small victory for Michael in the face of overwhelming hostility. For a moment, Michael let himself breathe, even though he knew it wasn't over yet. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room, his team, the defense, even the jury, on him. The weight of this case, the people it represented, was heavier than anything he had ever carried. But the weight wasn't just about this case. It was about something larger, something far more insidious. This was the system, the deep-rooted biases that ran through every corner of society. This case wasn't just about these employees. It was about everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or trampled on by a world that didn't take them seriously. The thought made Michael's resolve harden. He was here for more than just winning a case. He was here to prove that he wouldn't be overlooked, that no one like him would ever be silenced again. As the trial continued, the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with each passing minute. Michael noticed subtle glances exchanged between the opposing counsel and the judge. It was as if they were all in on something he wasn't privy to, and it was starting to gnaw at him. The feeling was growing, the realization that something wasn't right. He looked over at Adam, his trusted associate, and saw the same unease in his eyes. Adam, always calm in these situations, seemed on edge. His lips were pressed together, his posture stiff. Michael knew Adam well enough to see when something was wrong. Adam wasn't just nervous about the case. He was worried about something else. Michael could feel the tension in the room, but Adam's reaction told him that the stakes had just gotten a lot higher. "Michael," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't think this is just about the case anymore. We need to watch our backs. I think we're being set up." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to hear more. He knew exactly what Adam meant. This was no longer just a courtroom battle. This was becoming personal. As the trial broke for recess, Michael excused himself from the room, his mind racing. He stepped into the hallway, trying to regain control of his thoughts. Adam followed him, glancing over his shoulder, as if to make sure they weren't being watched. "Do you think it's a setup? Are they trying to push us into a corner?" Michael asked, his voice low. Adam nodded. "I've been hearing things. Some of the court officers have been talking. There's a rumor, nothing concrete, but it feels like they're trying to discredit us, make us look like the ones who are out of line. We've been targeted from the start." Michael's eyes narrowed. He had suspected as much, but hearing Adam's confirmation felt like a punch to the gut. They were dealing with something much bigger than a biased judge. They were dealing with a corrupt system that had already decided the outcome of this trial before it had even begun. It was a tactic Michael had seen before, one that played on the assumption that black men like him, no matter how successful or influential, were easy targets for manipulation. As the recess continued, Michael could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. He had been calm, composed, playing the game as it was meant to be played. But now, he could feel something shifting, something dangerous, taking shape just below the surface. He had no choice but to stay focused. There was no room for mistakes, no room for hesitation. His reputation, the case, everything was on the line. He stepped back into the courtroom, taking his seat beside Adam. The defense had already begun to present their closing statements, but Michael couldn't stop thinking about the shift in the air, the subtle undercurrents of hostility he could no longer ignore. The judge's glare was sharper now, more pointed. Every time Michael stood to make an objection, Judge Thomas seemed to dismiss him with a single wave of his hand. It was as if Michael's very presence in the courtroom was an inconvenience to the system that had already decided its winner. But then, something changed. In the middle of the defense's closing statement, as Michael sat there, steeling himself for the inevitable loss, the doors to the courtroom slammed open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room before settling on Michael. His heart skipped a beat. He had a sinking feeling that he knew what was coming next. "Mr. Harrison," one of the officers said, his voice loud and authoritative, "we need to speak with you. You're under arrest for obstructing justice." The words hit Michael like a brick. The room seemed to freeze, the air thick with disbelief. He turned to look at Adam, whose face had gone pale. The defense lawyer smiled. Just a fraction, but it was enough to confirm Michael's suspicion. This wasn't about law anymore. This was about silencing him. Michael stood slowly, his movements controlled, though inside his chest was a storm. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together the absurdity of what was happening. Arrested. For what? Obstructing justice. He had been in the fight of his life, working tirelessly to present the truth. And now he was being accused of the very thing they had all been guilty of. As the officers approached, Michael glanced around the room, taking in the stunned faces of the jury, the attorneys, and even Judge Thomas, who was watching with a cold, almost detached expression. It was clear. The system had already made its judgment, and Michael wasn't part of the plan. "Is this some kind of joke?" Michael asked, his voice steady but filled with an edge of disbelief. "This is not a joke, Mr. Harrison," the officer replied. "You're under arrest. Come with us." The room erupted in a flurry of motion. People whispered, some standing up, some sitting back in shock. Adam rushed to Michael's side, his voice desperate but low. "Michael, don't do this. We can't let them do this." But Michael stood tall, his face composed, though inside, the fury was building. This was the moment. This was the boiling point. He had been underestimated his entire life, dismissed, silenced, And now, here he was, being dragged into a corner, but this time, he wasn't backing down. He looked the officers in the eye. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, but unmistakable. The tension in the room spiked, everyone waiting for what would happen next. The moment had arrived. Michael was done playing by their rules. He was done letting them push him around. This wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about something much larger, something he had never realized until now. This was about fighting back. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. The officers' sudden appearance, their words slicing through the air like a blade, had thrown everything into disarray. Michael Harrison stood frozen, his pulse thundering in his ears. The officers were closing in on him, their authoritative steps echoing on the marble floor. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, every head turning in his direction. "Mr. Harrison, please," one of the officers said, his voice clipped and impatient. "You need to come with us." Michael's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Arrested for obstructing justice. He had just been doing his job, fighting for what was right. And yet, in a heartbeat, the system he had spent his entire career working within had flipped on him. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls narrowing, his breath shallow. The judge's gaze was fixed on him, cold and calculating. Judge Thomas hadn't even moved. His eyes were as unblinking as ever, the embodiment of the system that had made its decision long ago. The defense attorney, smug and self-assured, smirked. "See, Mr. Harrison," he said, turning to the judge, "we were right. This entire case was nothing but a distraction, a stunt to smear the character of a successful company." His words were thinly veiled, but the underlying message was clear. This was bigger than the case. This was about shutting Michael down. "Michael, don't!" Adam's voice broke through the growing cacophony, laced with panic. He stepped forward, his face pale, but his body still rooted firmly at Michael's side. "This is a trap. If you go with them—" Michael raised a hand, cutting him off. He didn't need to hear more. He could feel the trap closing in. The last few hours of the trial, the way the judge had dismissed his evidence, had been building up to this moment. The whispers, the subtle glances, the entire system was complicit in what was happening now. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was an orchestrated move to silence him, to ensure that the very people who needed a voice would remain unheard. He knew what this arrest meant. It meant they were trying to erase his credibility, to discredit his work, and to show everyone that even someone like him, successful, powerful, and respected, could be taken down with just a few well-placed words. Michael straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He couldn't allow this. He wouldn't let them see him break. It was everything he had learned in this fight. Remain calm, remain composed, even when the entire world was watching. But the anger inside him was building, a fire that he had been keeping at bay for far too long. The more he thought about what was happening, the blatant injustice, the lengths they were going to destroy his reputation, the more he realized that his approach had to change. He couldn't let them think that this was just about a case, about a courtroom dispute. This was about something far bigger, a fight for respect, for dignity, for justice. "Enough," Michael said, his voice sharp as a blade, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. His gaze locked on Judge Thomas, who was now standing, a thin smile playing at the edges of his lips. "You can't let this happen, Michael," Adam whispered urgently, his voice full of fear. "We can fight this. We have time. Don't let them win." But Michael didn't look away from the judge. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He wasn't just fighting for this case anymore. He was fighting for every black man, woman, and child who had been overlooked, dismissed, or crushed by a system that had never cared about them. He was fighting for the right to be seen as human, as an equal. And as the officers took another step forward, their hands hovering near him, Michael knew he could no longer play by their rules. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, firm. His eyes flicked from the officers to the judge, then to the defense attorney. "This is not just about this case. This is about the system that's been broken for years, and I won't let you keep pushing people down." A murmur of disbelief spread through the courtroom. The officers hesitated, confused by his defiance. But Michael wasn't done. "This isn't just about me," he continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "This is about every person you've silenced, every person you've ignored, every case you've dismissed, because it didn't fit your idea of what justice should look like." His gaze turned cold, locking onto Judge Thomas. "I will not let you turn this court into a mockery." The officers glanced at each other, clearly unsure of what to do. One of them stepped forward, his hand outstretched, but Michael remained resolute. His heart pounded, but he stood his ground, the fire in his chest burning brighter now. Judge Thomas sneered, a cold smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You've gone too far, Harrison. The law is the law, you can't change it." Michael's eyes narrowed. "The law doesn't protect people like me," he shot back, his voice ringing with cold, hard truth. "The law doesn't protect the people in this room, the ones who will never get a fair shot because of the color of their skin." He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him now. His words were like a spark, igniting a fire that was hard to ignore. There was a shift in the air, a palpable tension that hummed in the silence that followed his declaration. The jury, the defense, even the officers seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Michael knew what was at stake. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, one where he could either bow to the system or take a stand, no matter the consequences. He could feel the eyes of the world on him. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about rewriting the narrative. "Judge Thomas, you have two choices," Michael said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "You can let this trial proceed fairly, or you can continue to deny the truth. But know this." He stepped closer to the judge, his presence filling the room. "If you choose to deny justice, you will not be able to silence me. Not now, not ever." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. It felt as if time had slowed, every second stretching into eternity. Adam stepped forward, his hand reaching out, but Michael shook his head slightly, signaling for him to hold back. Michael knew this was his moment. If he was going to go down, he was going to do it on his own terms. He wasn't going to be dragged away quietly. He was going to fight, and if necessary, make this moment something they would remember forever. But then, before anything else could unfold, the doors to the courtroom swung open once again, this time with an unexpected figure stepping into the room. "Your Honor," a voice called from the doorway, cutting through the silence. It was a man Michael recognized instantly, Mitchell Green, a senior partner at the firm, and one of the few allies who had always stood by him, even when things got tough. Mitchell's expression was grim as he strode toward the front of the room, flanked by two other colleagues from the firm. "You're making a mistake here. You know it." Judge Thomas stiffened, his face darkening at the interruption. "What is this, more disruptions from the defense?" Mitchell, however, didn't flinch. "It's not just the defense, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about exposing the truth. The truth about how this case has been handled, the bias that's been allowed to fester here, and it's about time someone in this room stood up and said something." Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was unexpected, but Mitchell's timing couldn't have been more perfect. Mitchell's words, his presence, were exactly what Michael needed right now. A shift in the narrative that might just give him the upper hand. But as the tension grew, Michael could sense the storm on the horizon. The next few moments could change everything. The case, the fight, it all hung in the balance. The question was now clear. What would happen next? The courtroom stood in a tense silence. Michael Harrison's words hung in the air, like a challenge no one dared to ignore. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. His colleagues, the jury, the defense team, and most of all, Judge Thomas, who had yet to utter a word after Michael's fiery declaration. The officers still hovered in the doorway, but there was hesitation in their movements, uncertainty that wasn't there before. They could sense the gravity of the situation, could feel the swell of defiance emanating from Michael like an unspoken force. Mitchell Green, his ally from the firm, had entered the room just in time to provide the support Michael desperately needed. He walked forward now, his face set in a grim line, the weight of the firm's backing evident in his posture. Mitchell had seen Michael face adversity before, seen him fight against the tide, but today was different. Today, Michael was about to expose not just a bias in the courtroom, but the system that allowed it to thrive. "Judge," Mitchell said, his voice calm but commanding, "this case isn't just about the Thompson employees anymore. This is about the corruption that's poisoned this trial from the beginning. You know what's been happening in this room, and you know that this isn't a fair fight. You're complicit in this." The words struck the judge like a blow. The room went completely still. Judge Thomas's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, a flash of guilt or perhaps recognition crossing his features, but it was quickly masked by the same cold, authoritarian demeanor that had defined his behavior all afternoon. Michael could see it now. The judge, the defense attorney, and even the officers were part of a much larger system, a machine that worked tirelessly to uphold the status quo, no matter the cost. It wasn't just about legal technicalities anymore. It was about power, control, and the crushing weight of institutionalized bias. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Judge Thomas finally sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm running this courtroom, and I'll remind you both of that. You're free to speak your mind, but it doesn't change the fact that the law is the law." The thin line between professional composure and boiling anger snapped inside Michael's chest. He had kept his cool this whole time, had played by the rules, had tried to prove himself worthy of their respect. But no more. The system was broken, and he wasn't going to sit back while they trampled over justice. "That's the problem, isn't it, Judge?" Michael said, his voice rising with controlled anger. "The law is only the law when it suits you. You've dismissed the facts, you've ridiculed the witnesses, and you've allowed this trial to become a farce. But the truth—" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "The truth doesn't change because you ignore it." Judge Thomas's face reddened, but his eyes hardened with a cold, calculating rage. "Enough of this insolence," he spat. "I'm not going to stand here and let you lecture me. You've already crossed the line." One of the officers stepped forward again, his hand reaching for Michael's arm, but Michael didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his mind racing, calculating. This wasn't just about this moment anymore. It was about showing everyone in this room the depth of their prejudice, the corruption that permeated every inch of this courthouse. The truth was more than a defense. It was a weapon, and Michael was about to use it. "You don't scare me," Michael said, his voice low, but laced with unshakable resolve. "You think you can intimidate me, silence me, but I won't be ignored, not anymore." There was a beat of silence, and then, suddenly, the tension shattered. The defense attorney spoke up, his voice filled with venom. "This is ridiculous," he snarled, glaring at Michael. "You're disrupting the proceedings, you're obstructing justice, and frankly, you're a liability to everyone in this room. If you don't want to go quietly, we'll make sure you do. The consequences for your behavior are going to be severe." Michael's pulse quickened, but he didn't take his eyes off the attorney. This man, this entire system, had been trying to break him down from the moment he walked into that courtroom. But Michael wasn't just going to let them win. He had the truth on his side, he had the law on his side, and more importantly, he had something that none of them could take away: his integrity. He looked at Mitchell, who had been watching him closely, and gave a subtle nod. Mitchell understood immediately. He knew what Michael was planning. He had the same fire burning in his chest now, and together, they could turn this situation into a moment of reckoning. "Let's expose the truth then," Michael said, his voice steady. He turned toward the judge, his gaze unwavering. "Let's take a moment to look at the facts. The facts you've conveniently ignored. You think I'm the one obstructing justice? Then let's talk about the real obstruction. About the systematic bias you've allowed to persist in your courtroom. About the way you've protected companies like this one by burying the truth." Judge Thomas's eyes flickered again, this time with more anger than guilt, but Michael pressed on. "I've seen it for years," Michael continued. "I've seen how the system treats people like me, like the clients I represent. I've seen the ways you make exceptions, the way you turn a blind eye when it's convenient. But today, I'm not backing down. And if that means you arrest me for speaking the truth, then I'll wear that badge proudly." The room was quiet for a moment, and Michael could feel the weight of the words settling over everyone present. The officers, the defense attorney, the judge. They were all caught in this moment of truth. They were trapped by the very system they thought they controlled. And Michael wasn't going to let them off the hook. He glanced at Adam, who stood behind him, his face pale but resolute. Adam had been with him through every step of this case, and Michael could see the same resolve in his eyes. He wasn't backing down either. "I'll make sure the world knows what's happening here today," Michael said, his voice ringing out across the courtroom. The world will know that this trial wasn't about justice. It was about silencing the truth, but that's not going to happen. Not anymore. At that moment, the defense attorney moved forward, his face contorted with rage. "You're making a huge mistake, Harrison. You don't have the power to do this. You're out of your league here. You're just a lawyer, a pawn in a game much bigger than you." But Michael didn't flinch. "It's the system that's out of its league," he said calmly. "You want to call me a pawn, fine. But I'm not the one hiding behind lies and power. I'm standing up for what's right. And if you think that's something you can break, then you don't understand who you're dealing with." The judge slammed his gavel, but it was more out of frustration than control. "Enough!" he shouted. "Mr. Harrison, I will have you removed from this court if you don't leave now." Michael stood tall, not a single ounce of fear in his body. He was done being afraid, done allowing people like Thomas and the defense to control the narrative. He was done being pushed around. "I'm not leaving," Michael said, his voice steady, unyielding. "You can arrest me, you can do whatever you want, but you can't silence me. Not today." The officers hesitated again, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. They had expected him to comply, to back down. But Michael wasn't the man they had hoped for. He was a force, a man who had spent his life learning how to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. A deep silence hung in the air, thick with the tension of the moment. Michael could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had no idea what would happen next, but he was ready. Ready to face whatever came his way. Because in this moment, he wasn't just fighting for his career, for his reputation. He was fighting for something far greater. He was fighting for the future, for justice, for the truth. And as the room waited, the eyes of the world seemed to settle on him, waiting for his next move. This was his moment. The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch as Michael Harrison stood at the center, refusing to back down. His words had cut through the pretense, exposing the ugly truth of the trial. And now the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. The officers were still standing in the doorway, their hands hovering near their belts, eyes darting back and forth between Michael and the judge. Michael could feel the weight of the room upon him. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. Judge Thomas, his face turning redder with each passing second, slammed his gavel down once again. "Order!" he barked, his voice thick with frustration. "Mr. Harrison, you will leave this courtroom now, or I will have you forcibly removed." Michael's chest tightened, but he stood tall, his gaze unwavering. His hand rested at his side, his fingers curling into fists. He had been dismissed for too long. Dismissed by the system, by the judge, by the defense, by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. Today, he would not be ignored. Not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," Michael said. His voice calm, but laced with steely determination, he looked directly at Judge Thomas, unflinching. "You can have me removed, or you can hear the truth. But either way, this trial, this mockery of justice, ends now." The judge's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. His expression was one of fury and disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom someone, especially someone like Michael, defying him so openly. The tension in the courtroom thickened, the room filled with the kind of charged silence that only comes before a storm. Behind him, Adam moved forward, speaking softly, but urgently. "Michael, we need to think this through. This isn't just about the trial anymore. They'll bury us. We're fighting for more than just this case. Don't let them push us into a corner." But Michael didn't turn around. His gaze remained fixed on the judge. He could hear the concern in Adam's voice, but there was no going back now. This wasn't about survival. It was about justice. He had played their game long enough, had tried to prove his worth through their rules, but they had twisted the system to their advantage, and it was time to expose it all. "I'm not afraid of the consequences," Michael said, his voice rising now. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter. This is about every black man and woman who's been ignored, dismissed, and left out of the conversation. This ends today." Judge Thomas shot a look at the defense attorney, his eyes cold with a quiet fury. The defense lawyer, who had been sitting back with an arrogant smirk, now stood and approached the bench, whispering something into the judge's ear. Michael couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The defense attorney was playing his part in this sick game, trying to ensure that Michael would not escape the consequences of his defiance. "Mr. Harrison, I suggest you reconsider your position," the judge finally said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This trial is already a disgrace, and you're only making it worse." Michael's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, ignoring the officers as they shifted uneasily behind him. "No, Your Honor. You've made this a disgrace. You've allowed your bias, your personal views, to infect this courtroom and turn it into something it was never meant to be. The truth should have been heard, but you chose to ignore it. You chose to protect the powerful over the truth." The judge stiffened, his eyes narrowing as Michael's words landed like a slap. For a moment, Michael thought he saw something flicker in the judge's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same icy mask of authority. "You are out of line," the judge hissed. "I will not tolerate this behavior in my courtroom." At that moment, one of the officers stepped forward, his hand reaching out for Michael's arm. But Michael didn't flinch. Instead, he locked eyes with the officer, his expression hardening. "I am not going anywhere," Michael repeated, his voice low and deadly serious. "Not without the truth being heard. And if you think you can intimidate me, you're sorely mistaken." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. His hand lingered in the air, inches from Michael, but Michael didn't back down. He could feel the officer's uncertainty, his hesitation to move forward, and for a brief moment, the power shifted. But the tension broke when the defense attorney, desperate to regain control of the situation, spoke up. "This is absurd. This man is obstructing justice, Your Honor. We need to take action now." Michael's gaze flicked to the defense attorney, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He had expected this, the attempt to smear him, to paint him as the villain in this drama. The truth, though, was that the real villain had been hiding behind their polished rhetoric and their fake professionalism. It was time to turn the tables. "You think this is about me?" Michael said, his voice steady, but his words biting. "You think I'm the one obstructing justice? I'm the one standing here, risking everything to make sure the truth comes out. It's not me who's obstructing justice, it's you, all of you. You've been playing this game for too long, pretending to be neutral, pretending to care about justice. But deep down, you've been protecting the very people who have trampled on the rights of others for years." The room fell silent. The air hung thick with the weight of his words. For the first time, Michael saw something crack in the defense attorney's composure. The smug smile faltered, and the judge's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark behind his eyes. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Harrison," the defense lawyer growled. "You think you can take on the system? You're just one man, you'll be crushed." Michael's gaze was unwavering, his resolve hardening with every passing second. "I'm not trying to take on the system," he said, his voice low and full of authority. "I'm here to expose it, and when the truth comes to light, you'll be the ones who are crushed, not me." It was then that the judge made his move. With a swift motion, he slammed his gavel down. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice barely controlled. "If you're not going to cooperate, Mr. Harrison, I'll have no choice but to have you removed and held in contempt." But Michael stood his ground. He didn't flinch, didn't back away. This was his moment. The moment when he would make them all understand that they couldn't silence him anymore. The officers, once hesitant, now moved toward him again, their hands reaching for his arms, but Michael's body tensed. He could feel the muscles in his legs coiling, ready for what was coming. His mind raced, calculating his next move. There was no turning back now. He had to make this count. "Do you really want to do this?" Michael said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "You're going to arrest me for standing up for what's right. You're going to drag me out of here for exposing the corruption in your courtroom. Is that how you want to be remembered?" For a long moment, the officers didn't move. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Michael's words had done what he had hoped. They had forced everyone in that room to confront their own complicity, their own role in upholding a system that had failed to serve the truth. And then, as if on cue, something shifted. The officers stopped, their hands hanging in the air as they looked at each other, their resolve faltering. The defense attorney, too, seemed unsure now. They had underestimated Michael, thought he would be just another man they could push around, another voice that could be silenced with threats and intimidation. But Michael wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Mitchell stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Enough," he said, his voice steady and full of authority. "This ends now. This is no longer just about this case. We will make sure the world knows what's been happening here today. We won't let you sweep this under the rug." The judge's face contorted in rage, but there was nothing he could do now. The room was no longer his to control. Michael had taken the power back, and the entire system, every corrupt, biased layer of it, was being exposed. But as Michael looked around the courtroom, he knew this was just the beginning. The stakes were high, and the battle was far from over. He had made his stand, but the outcome was still uncertain. The courtroom stood still, a hushed silence enveloping the room like a thick fog. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped, each person frozen in place, unsure of what would happen next. Michael Harrison stood at the center, his gaze unwavering as he faced down the judge, the defense attorney, and the officers who had come to take him away. The air was thick with tension, but amidst the storm, Michael stood strong, his resolve as solid as steel. It was Mitchell Green who broke the silence. His voice, steady and commanding, cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "This is over, Your Honor," he said, his tone full of authority. "We will not let this trial continue under these circumstances." The judge's face twisted in anger, his hands shaking as he slammed the gavel down one last time. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "You'll both pay for this insubordination. I will have you both disbarred." But Mitchell didn't flinch. He held his ground, his eyes locked with Judge Thomas's. "No, Your Honor. You're the one who should be worried. This trial is a sham, and everyone here knows it. The truth is out. We have the evidence, and you can't hide behind your gavel any longer." The tension escalated as Mitchell's words sank in. The officers, who had been standing at the ready, began to falter. Their hands hovered by their holsters, but they didn't move to arrest Michael. Instead, they looked to each other, uncertain. It was clear that they didn't want to be the ones to drag a lawyer, especially one with such high-profile connections. Out of the room, they were caught in the moment, frozen between following orders and recognizing the weight of what Michael had just revealed. "Enough!" Judge Thomas barked, but his voice lacked the power it once had. He knew, deep down, that his control over the room was slipping. The walls that had been built around him, walls made of privilege and systemic bias, were beginning to crumble. And the foundation of those walls was built on the very injustice that Michael had been fighting against. At that moment, the door to the courtroom swung open with a force that sent a ripple through the crowd. In walked a group of reporters, their cameras trained on the scene. The press had arrived. Drawn by the whispers that had been circulating outside, word had spread like wildfire. Michael Harrison, a respected lawyer and partner at one of the most prominent firms in the city, was challenging the very system he had worked in for years. His defiance had ignited something in the air, a spark that couldn't be extinguished. "Mr. Harrison, can you comment on the allegations against Judge Thomas?" one reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward him. Michael turned to face the reporters, his chest swelling with the realization that the truth was now undeniable. The entire world was watching. His stance had changed, not just physically, but emotionally. He had shed the weight of trying to prove his worth. Now, he was here to expose the lies. "This isn't just about me, or about Judge Thomas," Michael said, his voice steady, his words carrying the force of someone who had been holding this moment in for far too long. "This is about every person who has been pushed aside, every voice that has been silenced, every system that has been corrupted by those who think they are untouchable. It's time for that to end." The room shifted once more. The reporters, their cameras rolling, caught every word. The rest of the courtroom was still, each person hanging on to Michael's every syllable. The defense attorney's face turned pale, his arrogance quickly replaced by unease. The judge, too, was no longer the unchallenged authority. His face betrayed the cracks in the armor he had so carefully constructed. "You're finished, Thomas," Michael continued, his gaze fixed on the judge. "Everyone in this room, and everyone out there, now knows the truth. "You may have thought you could get away with this, but you can't hide from it anymore. The corruption stops now." The judge recoiled, his lips trembling, but he was no longer the powerful figure he once had been. The system had begun to turn on him, and there was no place left to hide. Behind him, the defense attorney's confidence had evaporated, replaced by a quiet panic. The room was no longer under their control. Michael's voice had cracked their illusions wide open. The officers stepped back, as if suddenly realizing the situation was beyond their comprehension. They exchanged a brief, uncomfortable look, and then slowly, their hands left their holsters. They were not going to take Michael into custody. Not today. The weight of the room, the pressure of the moment, was too much for them to bear. "Leave him be!" Mitchell called out, his voice calm and resolute. He stood beside Michael now, his presence reinforcing Michael's strength. "We'll deal with the aftermath in the courts, but not here, not now." The reporters gathered closer, pressing their microphones forward. Flashbulbs popped, capturing the moment for the world to see. Michael Harrison, a black lawyer in a corrupt system, had not only stood up to it, he had dismantled it, piece by piece, with nothing but his words and his unyielding resolve. As Michael stepped forward, the room parted before him. He didn't need to say anything more. His message had been heard loud and clear. The truth had been exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The system had been shaken to its core, and the pieces were starting to fall. In the days that followed, the fallout from that courtroom confrontation was nothing short of explosive. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it across the globe. Michael's name became synonymous with courage, defiance, and the fight for justice. The footage from the courtroom, the moment he had stood firm against the judge, the defense, and the entire system, was replayed over and over. People rallied behind him, inspired by his refusal to bow down to the powers that had held him and others like him in place for too long. But as the public's support grew, so did the attacks from those who had tried to silence him. Judge Thomas was placed under investigation, but his resignation was swift, a clear admission of guilt. The defense attorney faced scrutiny as well, with his connections to corporate interests coming under fire. It wasn't just the judge and the defense who were exposed, it was the system itself. The walls had crumbled, and the cracks were showing. Michael, however, didn't bask in the glow of his newfound fame. He was driven by something deeper, something more personal. In the aftermath of the trial, he realized that this moment, this victory, was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by his colleagues and supporters, Michael took a deep breath. He could hear the chants, the calls for reform. People were demanding change, demanding accountability, and Michael knew he couldn't walk away. He wasn't finished. "I'm not done," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This fight isn't just about one case, one judge, or one courtroom. It's about the countless people who will never have their voices heard. It's about creating a system that works for all of us, not just for the powerful." The crowd erupted into applause. Michael's heart swelled, not with pride, but with a sense of duty. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would continue to fight, not just for his own future, but for the future of the people who had been marginalized for far too long. As the applause died down, Michael looked around, taking in the faces of the people who had come together in the wake of his confrontation. They had all stood together, demanding justice, demanding change. And Michael knew that they would continue to stand together, no matter what came next. But as the crowds began to disperse, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one battle in a much larger war. There was still so much work to be done, so many systems to tear down, so many injustices to expose. With that thought, Michael turned and walked away, his footsteps firm and resolute. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next.